I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. It sounds like an audacious claim to make these days, doesn't it? To tell somebody who says they don't believe in Jesus that he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. Or is it really audacious to say that? Perhaps it's something that God has put into the heart of every individual he has created to desire him as Father and to know there must be a way, and he has provided a way. And when that way is revealed, it is clear through our Lord Jesus Christ. When I was a new believer in my early 20s, I got with some guys in New York City who were preaching in the subways. And there were fire and brimstone preachers in between the subway cars, and they went by. They only had a few moments. They would say, don't you know that if you die without Jesus, you will go to hell? I tried to preach like that, but it just wasn't my personality. It didn't work. But what worked for me, though, was engaging people in the subway platforms on a one-on-one basis. And you know, if you don't approach somebody in a wide-eyed, fanatical way, but you show some conviction in what you believe, they tend to want to engage with you. They want to know, what is the source of your belief? Now, this was in the late 90s, when in New York City, there were a lot of people, young adults especially, who were raised in the faith, but decided, no, it's not for me anymore. I'm going to find my own way. And so I encountered one of these individuals, and his defenses were up, and he was telling me with great confidence why he doesn't believe anymore. And then the verse came to mind. I hadn't intentionally memorized it, and I was a new Christian, but it just came to the surface. I looked him in the eye, and I said, Jesus said that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by him. And then suddenly his countenance changed, his defenses went down, and he lost all confidence. And the conversation went on. Now, I believe what happened in his mind was unconscious, but he recognized what he heard as a youth, that Jesus was a good man. And as is common to say that, oh yeah, I believe he was an historical figure. You can't deny that. He was just a good man and people found him. But God, someone we must follow? I don't think that's true. But we have this idea that C.S. Lewis puts forth in his famous book, The Mere Christianity, where he says, well, you know, if he's a good man, but you don't believe he is who he says he is, then he's a liar, in which case he can't be a good man. Or if you think he was just crazy, then he must be a lunatic. But we know from how he was able to articulate the faith, he was able to confound his detractors, that he wasn't crazy. So if he's not a liar or a lunatic, then he must be Lord. And this calculation you don't need to make consciously to know it in the depth of your heart, which is why I believe his defenses went down when I was able to proclaim that very simple verse, that no one comes to the Father but by him. Yes, he is the way, the truth, and the life. But the question, though, is if someone knows this deep down, why did they deny it? Well, I think we have a good example in Aldous Huxley, that famous 20th century philosopher. You may know him as the one who wrote Brave New World. But what he said was that he and his friends, and really a whole movement of philosophy that came to practically dominate the 20th century, looked to meaningless as a way to their own personal freedom. And he admitted, he said, I had motives for not wanting the world to have meaning. And so he developed, along with others, a philosophy of meaninglessness. And he did that so that he could throw off a whole system of morality. He wrote this in his 1937 book, Ends and Means. So the means to the end was this philosophy of meaningless. The end was to pursue hedonism, especially sexual freedom. At this point in his life, though, when he wrote that book, he'd become more spiritual. He took his mask off, and as well as the masks of many others. And so, as Blaise Pascal famously said, the heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. And so the heart has a way of turning us from the inherent reasonableness of the faith. There are other people, however, who had certain hopes in the world, but they were dashed because of disappointments. And so the question is, they lose confidence and look for other ways forward. That could be at the basis of why many people attended a Satanist event in Baltimore just yesterday. It took place in a venue called the Mobtown Ballroom, where they do swing dancing on ordinary weeks. But the Satanists had a revival patterned after an old school church revival meeting. And so I went there to pray and to sprinkle holy water around the place. And as I got to the front, someone greeted me who seemed like he might have been the organizer of the event. And he said, "Thanks for being here. I'm glad you came." For a moment there, I thought he was thinking that I was somebody who wanted to attend the event because I was dressed in black, just like everybody else I saw going into that place. But then I realized he knew I was a priest and he wasn't being sincere. At that point, he made a gesture with his hand and said, "Hail Satan," to which I simply replied, "God bless you." And he thanked me as he turned away. Now, I don't think that thank you was especially sincere either, but I do believe that planted a seed in him because he recognizes in the depth of his heart that there is a God who created the world and that God is a source of blessing. What happened to him that he's looking for another source of gratification? We can pray for him. The thing is that Satan cannot create. He only imitates, just as this organization imitated church meetings. And as I saw some other people coming out of that venue, I heard someone say, a couple, and the woman said to her husband or the man she was with, "That was refreshing." But of course, Satan is not the source of refreshing, but God is the source of living water. And so what they're ultimately desiring is what only God can give. People gathered around and talking with familiarity outside of the event. They're looking for fellowship. There's no fellowship in hell. So ultimately, they're seeking what only God can provide. And so Jesus, when he is speaking to his disciples, he seems to, well, very much doesn't seem to, it's very clear, he assumes a certain familiarity that they don't recognize on the surface. For Philip says to him, "Lord, show us the Father, and we shall be satisfied." And Jesus basically, he just says to him, "How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? You already know the Father," he tells him. Just like the men in this event or the fellow on the subway platform have a deep desire for the fatherhood of God, and they want the way to him. And when Jesus says, "I can show you the way," that touches something deep within. At the beginning of the passage, Jesus tells his disciples that in my Father's house are many rooms. Now, this is something that people often object to, this idea of heaven. Oh, we don't see heaven. How can that be real? This seems like it's just you might derisively say, some kind of a leap of faith. I believe in rationality, which is a misunderstanding of Soren Kierkegaard's idea of a leap of faith, because the Christian faith is inherently rational. We don't have to make a leap to believe it. We can understand it in a reasonable way, stepwise. And so again, assuming a certain knowledge, Jesus says that you know the way where I am going, even though they've already asked the way. C.S. Lewis acknowledges that all of us have a deep desire for heaven, whether we admit it or not. And he points this to the argument from desire. Now, he points out that we have many hopes that we hold on to throughout the world. It could be in a marriage. But even the best of marriages, he says, do not fully satisfy the God-sized hole that we have in our hearts. Same thing can be said for a career or international travel. Even the best that the world can offer never fully touches that need for the Heavenly Father. And so John Lennon in 1966, even though he wrote the famous song, Imagine There Is No Heaven, I never really believed that was a defiant song against God, even though it was very controversial at the time. There was a sitcom, WKRP in Cincinnati, which did a piece on this song, and the owner of the radio station was grappling with, should I put it on the air? And ironically, it was the blonde bombshell in this show, Lonnie Anderson, who said, no, you shouldn't put it on the air. And so, sure enough, John Lennon was just seeing the wars in the world and saying, there's so much of them seem to be caused by religion, and God can't be for wars. But 10 years later, in 1977, he saw on TV Jesus of Nazareth. And that's where he heard the gospel for the very first time. And that's where he laid down his armor. His defenses fell, and he began attending church. And so it is for our children who we nurture in the faith. Before I turn briefly, before I close, to our children who are being confirmed today, just a brief illustration about my mother at the very end of her life. Because throughout my whole life, never heard her pray. She was resolute and would not even talk about why she did not believe. But in her 87th year, nearing the end of her life, I thought, I need to try one more time. And I said, she was becoming nostalgic of her youth. And I said, Mom, let's just pray, just like you did when you went to Sacred Heart School. She said, no, I can't believe, I don't believe those things. And I just looked at her and I said, Mom, deep down, you know it's true. She looked down for a moment, looked up and said, I guess you're right. From that moment on, for the last year of her life, she was able to pray without any difficulty. And so it is with our children who are baptized into the faith before they're able to profess it. If they could speak, they would profess the faith, because every child is born, which is what we teach in our Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, every child is born with a relationship with God. And I've seen grandparents bring their little children here whose parents won't bring them to church, and every single one of them is excited about Jesus and wants to learn more. So we have nurtured their faith, and here they are confirmed in that faith today. That is the faith that God has put into each of our hearts. That is the faith for which we were created. So the more we know this to be true, the more we are confident that God created us for this fulfillment, the more we're able to present it with courage in a fallen world.